Good afternoon, this is Media Center Ukraine, Odessa. Our today's briefing is dedicated to human rights violations in the occupied territories. We're having with us Vira Yastrebova, lawyer, director of the NGO Shidna Pravozahisna grupa, Eastern Human Rights Group. The floor is yours. Good afternoon. During today's briefing, I would like to share some aspects of violations of human rights in the uncontrolled territories. I believe this is important information for Ukrainian citizens and journalists. The focus is now on heroic deeds of our army aimed at liberating those territories. But I also believe that it is very important to understand what is going on there and what the local population is forced to do by the local administrations and what violations locals face. Today I would like to share details about the continuation of forced mobilization in the territories which are occupied and the preparation of the new stage of mobilization. In March this year, the leaders of the occupation administrations of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, so-called heads of the administrations, signed decrees on the establishment of commissions for the initial registration of citizens on military registration and the initial registration of citizens born in 2006. This forced mobilization is also related to those who are older. In accordance with these so-called decrees, all male citizens residing on the territory of the temporarily occupied Luhansk and Donetsk regions who have reached the age of 17, as well as older male citizens who are not on military registration. We know about several waves of forced mobilization in temporarily occupied territories, but the adoption of these decrees structures the whole process of forced mobilization and makes it obligatory. So in the temporarily occupied territories, they try to legitimate everything. They are more focused on younger males, namely those who reach the age of 17. The occupiers wanted to finalize the process by the end of March 2023, and now they try to register older people by the end of 2023. The heads of the so-called state bodies of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, administrations of cities and regions, educational institutions, regardless of their subordination and form of ownership, must ensure the organized appearance of citizens. First, they were more focused on educational institutions because young men of 17 were their priority, but now they decided to cover institutions, organizations, and enterprises because they want to fulfill Kremlin's plans by the end of this year and also to mobilize older people. The ministries of internal affairs of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's republics were instructed to conduct a search in their so-called legal grounds to detain citizens who evade military registration. According to the information we have, the occupation authorities decided to change their approach to the distribution of summons. Summons will now be issued upon mandatory military registration, and those who refuse will be searched for by the internal affairs bodies of the mentioned entities. This means that locals don't want to be registered because they understand what was the fate of those who joined collaborators. They don't want to die for Putin and Kremlin in the temporarily occupied territories as well. That's why there is now forced military registration through the military machine, namely Russian National Guard and other punity bodies of the Russian Federation. And we can say that there is now a terror against local populations, because for them people are statistics and they want to register for military service as many people as possible according to the plans. The second topic I would like to cover today is the healthcare system in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. I've already told you about forced donorship that also includes teenagers. But what about the healthcare system in general and the right to get decent healthcare services? Our sources report that there is a problem with medical personnel in the occupied territories, namely the lack of medical workers and doctors in the territories of Ukraine occupied by Russia. According to information from our own sources, the medical institutions of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia and Kherson regions operate in the mode of frontline hospitals. Out of the 450 medical institutions in the occupied territories, only less than 25% are open and functioning. So there are 100 medical institutions which are open, but they lack doctors. There are no conditions for proper examination and testing. So they cannot provide proper medical care. There are also no medical mobile teams. So the ambulances do not operate there. That's why it is impossible for local residents to get quick medical help. According to reports from locals, it became known that in the occupied territories there are practically no drugs for patients who are sick with HIV or tuberculosis. There is also almost no preventive measures, which leads to an increase in the number of people who have been diagnosed with HIV and tuberculosis. We understand that for such diseases, preventive measures are of paramount importance. But the residents of the temporarily occupied territories unfortunately cannot get such services. As for the conflicts in the temporarily occupied territories between collaborators and officials from the Russian Federation, they don't care about people. People are just like material for them. The main task is to mobilize these people There is no proper healthcare systems, but there are still conflicts there between those who decided to cooperate with the Russian Federation and regular officials. In the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, the authorities of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics have begun to integrate into Russian legislation and have already begun the process of dismissing local collaborators. The leaders of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic signed decrees on the liquidation of 31 executive parties of the occupation administrations which were created in 2015. Liquidation must be carried out before the 1st June of 2023. The occupational government of the so-called Donetsk People Republic will carry out such actions a little later. There has been submitted a draft law on the government of the Luhansk People's Republic that was submitted to the People's Council that determines the competence, composition, and the structure of the government of the Lugansk, so-called Lugansk People's Republic, the procedure for the activities and relations of the government of the so-called Lugansk People's Republic with federal government bodies of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation. A new system and structure of the executive parties of the occupying power was approved in connection with the entry of so-called Luhansk People's Republic into the legal field of the Russian Federation. According to these so-called documents, 29 authorities will be formed on the territory of the occupied Luhansk region. According to our sources, with creation of new authorities, the reduction of local collaborators can reach 75%, and preference will be given to managers from the Russian Federation. These actions led to a conflict between local collaborators and appointees to the occupation administrations from the Russian Federation, which led to repressive actions against collaborators. Nobody needs traitors. And those who forgot about this in 2014 and in 2022 and started collaborating with the occupier, the Russian Federation, shall now understand that the Russian Federation doesn't need those who violate their or who betrayed their homeland. There is a trend now of so-called career lift. Those Russian officials who want to get better jobs are now so-called political tourists who go to the occupied territories, where they participate in the crimes of the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine, and they just support Putin, Kremlin, and the regime that started the full-scale war against Ukraine. Those collaborators in the temporarily occupied territories who believed that they will be able to work with occupiers there and will solve all the issues with the Russian Federation are now facing sanctions. We will closely monitor what will happen to these people. Most of them have now criminal proceedings initiated against them in the controlled territories of Ukraine, and they are no more needed there in the occupied territories. I would also like to tell today about creation of a repressive machine of the Russian Federation on the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. The State Duma of the Russian Federation and the Federation Council adopted laws on the creation of federal courts of general jurisdiction, arbitration and military courts in the occupied territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson oblasts, and on the procedure for selecting candidates. The Supreme Qualification Board of Judges of the Russian Federation will select candidates for judges in the occupied territories, which will soon announce a competition to open vacancies for court chairmen, their deputies, and judges, who will go to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to work. The occupation system of courts is necessary for the occupiers to fully launch the repressive machine in the occupied territories. Moreover, according to local sources, the occupation administrations are accelerating the process of recruiting law enforcement agencies in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We've already reported about establishment of units of the National Guard, the Prosecutor's Office, the Investigative Committee, the Police, and the FSB. At the moment, staffing is carried out at the expense of arriving citizens of the Russian Federation as business travelers. There they can receive increased salary, awards. So the repressive machine has been already established there, and unfortunately now they will be able to create those quasi-courts recruiting Russian citizens. At the same time, the social and economic situation in the occupied territories is terrible. Non-payment of wages to employees of enterprises in the territories of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. After the annexation has been increasing. There are around 8 temporary administrations in the territory of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, and now there are the issues with the wages. And they create temporarily administrative commissions, and all the debts that have been liquidated. They change the name of enterprises, they change their form of economic activities, make it impossible to pay debts to employees. They also don't pay wages to mobilized miners who are missing in action or were killed. The Russian Federation mobilized men in the so-called temporarily occupied territories. And of course, we should expect a quite significant protest potential. But the Russian Federation has been developing the repression machine covering the National Guard, the local law enforcement bodies. The Kremlin understands that locals do not support them, and they won't support them in the future. And to avoid full destabilization of the situation, they take such cruel, illegal actions. I believe it is important to speak about these cases, and I would like to ask journalists to publish articles about this situation and to conduct their investigation. It is important for our international partners to understand that we still need their support. And we will be able to repel the enemy from our territories only if you're united. And we need to free people from that terror that has been happening there. And we will be able to live in peaceful, democratic Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Vira. Thank you for your speech. The questions from the floor. Michael Vasura, Journal Newsweek. Mobilization, healthcare issues, the conflict between collaborators and officials, and the creation of this repression machine. Are there any differences between the territories who have been occupied for all around 9 years and those territories have been occupied since March 2022? What is the difference between Donetsk and Melitopol? As for the forced mobilization, there is really a difference between the territories who have been occupied since 2014 and other territories. In previously occupied territories, the Russian Federation started mobilization earlier. So now the male population has been almost fully mobilized, and most of them have already died in this aggression, because the occupation administration created such a repressive mechanism. When men were detained in the streets, when they were going to work, they were taken by bus to the points, so-called mobilization points, where people were registered and sent to the combat line. Why have they started this mechanism? They want to show to the Kremlin the amount of new military units, because they want to demonstrate that they are able to continue the military aggression against Ukraine. What are the challenges of the occupation administrations in the territories that were occupied after February last year? The process potential is higher there. Those people who didn't want to work in mines and metallurgical plants left for unoccupied territories of Ukraine, and they didn't want to come back there. And we understand the quick pace of the events in spring last year. After cities and towns were occupied, including Melitopol, locals had no opportunity to leave those places. There were attempts to create green corridors, but all these attempts were blocked by the Russian Federation. They tried to create an iron curtain for propaganda to be able to still show that there is still some life there, that there are people still living there. As for healthcare institutions, the situation is quite difficult in all those territories. We have reports of local population that prove that after occupation of the territories, there was mass looting of venues, facilities, including hospitals, when they took expensive equipment from there, because perhaps they hadn't seen such things, such equipment in the Russian Federation, because we know the living conditions in the Russian Federation in the remote areas. The next question, please. The question about healthcare institutions and the lack of drugs against tuberculosis and HIV. What is the problem? Is the problem that there are no medicine and the drugs in the somewhere in the Russian Federation? And who actually supplied those drugs to those territories before the full-scale invasion, before the war? As you say, before the full-scale invasion, the situation was dramatically different. The territories that were controlled by the Ukrainian government had special programs of the relevant ministry to supply equipment, medication, and also to ensure salary for doctors. Of course, there is always room for the improvement. That healthcare system needs more support from the state budget, but the healthcare system was ensured there. There were medical services. There were both private and public clinics, and there were special programs to ensure equipment and medication. As for doctors, the priority of the occupation administrations is to provide healthcare services to the military. That's why those doctors who were ready to collaborate with them are now involved in providing their services in military hospitals. So we are now talking about hospitals, military hospitals, where injured or wounded Russian soldiers are admitted, as well as those who were forcibly mobilized to the Russian army. Ordinary people there, ordinary locals, they don't have now the possibility to get healthcare services, because the doctors have left those territories, but those doctors who arrived, they are mainly surgeons, therapists, those who deals with prosthesis. So those people who can provide treatment to the Russian military. You cannot go to endocrinologist or ophthalmologist in the occupied territories. There is no eye surgeries now. It is next to impossible there. Those people who need such aid, they cannot get it, and the situation does not change. So there is approach to locals, that locals are resources that can pay taxes to the budget of the Russian Federation. Their children are zombified by the propaganda. And they also send these children to forced donorship. This is what is happening there now. And the last question about the creation of the repressive machine. Are there any similarities between the processes that are now taking place in Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast and the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics that took place 9 years ago? Is it the same or not? those territories who were occupied before 2022, those territories that have been occupied since 2014, 2015, they were the administrations of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. And the propaganda said that they were locals, so they were trying to find the professionals they needed in prosecutor's office, in local administrations, in local courts, and local police. So they tried to find collaborators or agents of the Kremlin and Putin. When it comes to local administrations, they were mainly formed by the representatives of the Ukrainian Party of Regions. The situation is different now. The process is more centralized. And the priority is given now to the Russian citizens. And now we can see this political tourism from the Russian Federation to the occupied territories of Ukraine. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? There are no questions. Then we will stop here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us today. That was Vira Yastrebova, the head of the NGO Shidna Pravozahisna grupa. That was our last briefing for today. See you tomorrow.